The air at the Miller Estate auction hung thick and heavy, a humid cocktail of stirred dust, cheap cigar smoke, and the bittersweet tang of a family farm giving up the ghost. It was June of 1972, and the feeling in the air wasn't sadness, but opportunity. Grain prices were climbing a ladder to the moon, and every farmer in Gibson County with a line of credit was there to get a piece of the action. Silas Blackwood stood near the back, his arms crossed over a chest as solid as an oak stump. His chambray shirt was worn soft at the elbows, the collar frayed from years of sun and sweat. He watched the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Earl, work the crowd like a preacher at a revival meeting. A nearly new John Deere 4320, paint still gleaming, was on the block. The bids jumped in $500 increments, the sound of them like hammer blows driving nails into the coffin of Old Man Miller's legacy. 2-5, I got 22.5, now 3, gimme 23, Earl chanted, his voice a rhythmic rasp. Rich Sterling, holding court near the front, flashed a two-fingered sign. He was tall and lean, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He wore a crisp seed corn cap, not a drop of sweat on his brow. Everything about him was new. His Ford pickup, his polished boots, the easy way he spent the bank's money. Sold to Mr. Sterling for $23,000, Earl bellowed, pointing a thick finger. A ripple of impressed murmurs went through the crowd. Sterling just nodded, a king accepting his due. He'd already bought the Miller farm itself last month, leveraging his existing 300 acres to snap up another 200. Now he was buying the iron to work it. Silas felt a familiar tightening in his gut. It wasn't envy, not exactly. It was a deep instinctual caution, the kind his father had beaten into him, along with the knowledge of how to set a plough. Debt is a wolf, son, his father used to say, his voice rough as burlap. It looks tame when you feed it, but it'll eat you alive the second you run out of meat. Silas ran 160 acres, free and clear. The land had been in his family since the Homestead Act. His house was small, his barn needed paint, and his machinery wasn't much to look at. His main workhorse was a 1959 John Deere 730 diesel, the two-cylinder engine a steady, comforting rhythm against the landscape. He knew every bolt on that tractor, every quirk of its pony motor on a cold morning. It was his. Every last piece of it. Sterling caught Silas's eye and sauntered over, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Morning, Blackwood. You here to pick up a coffee can full of bolts or something?" he asked, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. A few men chuckled. "Just watchin', Rich," Silas said, his voice level. He didn't give Sterling the satisfaction of a reaction. "You ought to be buying," Sterling pressed, gesturing at the line of shiny green and red machinery. "This is the time, Silas. A man's a fool not to expand. Get big or get out. You can't farm in the 70s with museum pieces." He clapped Silas on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly but felt like a branding iron. Silas just nodded, his gaze drifting past Sterling to the end of the equipment line where the real junk was parked. Tucked behind a rusted-out grain wagon and a cultivator with bent tines was a hulking shape of faded yellow. It was an old bulldozer, an Alice Chalmers, probably an HD6 from the looks of its stout, simple frame. It was a beast of a thing, 10 tons of forgotten iron. One track was half buried in the mud, and a fine coat of rust bloomed on the blade. Grease, thick and black as tar, caked the undercarriage, mixed with a decade of dirt. "Now what in the hell is that?" Sterling scoffed, following Silas's gaze. "Looks like they pulled that out of the river." Just then, Earl moved down the line. "All right, boys, let's clear out the scrap. What am I bid for this old Alice Chalmers crawler? We ain't even tried to start it. Selling it as is, where is? Good for an anchor or a yard ornament. Let's start the bidding at $100 for scrap." Silence. The crowd was here for productive machinery, for horsepower and hydraulics, not for a project that looked like it would consume more money than it could ever make. A few men laughed outright. "Scrap man'll give you 50 for it, Earl," someone yelled, and the laughter grew. Silas, however, was looking closer. He saw past the rust. He saw the straight, undented blade. The undercarriage, though caked in grime, didn't show signs of excessive wear on the sprockets. The pins and bushings looked decent for its age. He recognized the engine, a Buddha diesel, known for being tough as nails and simple to work on. This wasn't just scrap, this was potential. He had a low-lying 20 acres of swampland choked with scrub trees that he'd always dreamed of clearing and tiling. A dozer was the only way. A new one was unthinkable, and hiring the work out would cost thousands. "I got $50, Silas said, his voice clear and steady in the quiet that followed the laughter. The crowd turned to look at him. Sterling rolled his eyes, a theatrical display of disbelief. $50? You gonna push dirt around your garden with that thing, Blackwood? $50 bid from Silas Blackwood. Now 75. Who'll give 75? Earl chanted, trying to work up some enthusiasm. Crickets. Come on, boys. The blade's worth more than that in scrap. Silas stood his ground, his face a mask of stone. He'd done his homework. He'd seen the dozer listed on the auction bill and spent 2 nights at the library poring over old implement manuals. He knew what he was looking at. Sold, for $50 to Silas Blackwood. Earl banged his hand on the fender of a nearby tractor. You haul it, Silas. The deal was done. A wave of snickers and head-shaking followed the announcement. Sterling walked back over to Silas, a pitying look on his face. $50, huh? Well, I guess every man needs a hobby. While you're tinkering with that relic, I'll be buying up the county. You can't stop progress, Silas. You just can't. He patted his checkbook in his front pocket and walked away, back to the world of easy credit and shiny paint. Silas ignored him. He walked over to his prize. He laid a calloused hand on the cold steel of the blade. It was rough, pitted with age, but it was solid. Underneath the grime and neglect, he could feel the heart of a good machine. He had bought it for the price of a decent dinner for 2. He knew the work ahead would be monumental, but the thought didn't scare him. It settled him. This was his way. Build, don't borrow. Fix, don't finance. Before we go any further with this story, I have to ask you something. Think back to a time you saw a piece of old equipment, an old car, or even just a tool at a garage sale that everyone else overlooked. That thing that was labeled as junk. But you could see the potential in it. What was it, and did you save it? Drop a comment down below and tell that story, because I think a lot of us know exactly the feeling Silas had standing there with his $50 10-ton gamble. Getting the HD6 home was a battle in itself. He had to hire a lowboy trailer from the co-op, and the fee was more than he'd paid for the dozer. Winching the dead machine onto the trailer bed was a 4-hour ordeal of snapping cables, groaning metal, and curses muttered under his breath. The haul back to his farm was a slow, nerve-wracking crawl. His old Chevy C60, a trusty grain truck but no heavy hauler, strained against the weight. The engine screamed in low gear up every slight incline, the temperature needle creeping toward the red. More than once, he saw Rich Sterling's new pickup pass him, Sterling giving a dismissive wave as he sped by. Each time, Silas just gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white, and kept his eyes on the road. He parked the trailer behind his barn, in the spot where the old machine would become either his greatest triumph or his most public folly. For the first week, it just sat there, an immense yellow monument to his stubbornness. His wife, Martha, a pragmatic woman with kind eyes and a spine of steel, didn't say a word against it. She just brought him his coffee in the morning and watched him from the kitchen window as he'd circle the dozer, studying it from every angle like a general planning a campaign. You know what you're doing, C? She finally asked one evening, her hands busy shelling peas. I think so, he said, rubbing the grease from his hands with a rag. It's all mechanical, Martha. No fancy electronics, just levers, steel and diesel. It was built to be fixed. The real work began with a pressure washer he borrowed from a neighbor. For 2 solid days, he blasted away the caked-on mud and grease, revealing the machine beneath. The faded Alice Chalmers decals appeared like ghosts on the fuel tank. He uncovered grease zerks that hadn't seen a grease gun since the Kennedy administration. With the grime gone, he could finally do a proper inspection. The track rollers were worn, but serviceable. The final drives weren't leaking, a good sign. The engine, however, was a mystery. The Buddha diesel was started by a small 2-cylinder gasoline engine called a pony motor. It was a common setup on old crawlers. The pony motor would turn over the big diesel until it built up enough heat and oil pressure to fire on its own. Silas spent a week on that pony motor alone. He pulled the carburetor and rebuilt it on his workbench, the tiny jets and floats spread out on a clean rag. He filed the points, replaced the cracked spark plug wires, and drained the sludgy oil. He flushed the tiny fuel tank, which was full of rust and what smelled like varnish. Finally, the day came to try it. He filled the pony motor with fresh gas, checked the oil, and pulled the choke. He wrapped the thick rope around the flywheel and gave it a mighty heave. The engine sputtered, coughed a puff of blue smoke, and died. He tried again, and again. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. His shoulder began to ache. On the 10th pull, it caught. The little engine roared to life, a ridiculously high-pitched racket against the quiet of the farm. It was a small victory, but it felt enormous. He let it run for 10 minutes, warming up, before engaging the pinion gear that connected it to the main diesel's flywheel. The sound changed to a deep rhythmic chugging as the small engine strained to turn over the massive one. Chug, chug, chug. Silas climbed into the operator's seat, the steel cold through his jeans. He checked the compression releases, cracked the throttle on the diesel, and watched the oil pressure gauge. The needle flickered, then began a slow climb. When the pressure was right, he closed the compression releases. The load on the pony motor doubled. The chugging deepened into a heavy, laboring groan. The whole 10-ton machine shuddered. He pushed the throttle further. For a long moment, nothing happened. He could hear the diesel pistons fighting against the compression, a deep internal struggle within the iron block. He was about to give up when there was a cough. A plume of black smoke shot from the simple exhaust stack, thick and oily. Then another cough, louder this time. Suddenly, with a deafening roar, the big Buddha diesel fired on its own. The ground beneath the dozer vibrated. The sound was a deep, guttural thunder that echoed off the barn, a sound of pure, raw power that hadn't been heard in that county for years. Silas disengaged the pony motor and pulled the diesel throttle back to a steady idle. The machine sat there, shuddering and pulsing with life. He couldn't help but break into a wide grin. He had done it. Over the next few months, the dozer became his evening project. He drained all the fluids, replacing gallons of milky, water-contaminated oil from the engine, transmission, and final drives. He serviced the dry-type air cleaner, a monstrous canister filled with oil-soaked mesh. He tightened the tracks, a brutal job involving a wrench 4 feet long and every ounce of his strength. The community watched. Neighbors would slow their trucks as they passed, shaking their heads at the sight of Silas, covered in grease, wrestling with the ancient machine. The talk at the grain elevator and the feed store was always the same. Poor Silas Blackwood, good man but stuck in the past. While rich Sterling's buying up the world, Silas is playing with scrap iron. Sterling himself made a point of driving his new equipment past Silas's place. One afternoon, while Silas was trying to weld a crack in the dozer's blade, Sterling roared by in a brand-new John Deere 4630, the air-conditioned Soundguard cab completely sealed off from the dust and heat. He didn't even have to turn his head to look over. The message was clear. That was the future of farming, quiet, comfortable, and powerful. What Silas was doing was the past, loud, dirty, and obsolete. The contrast couldn't have been starker, and Silas felt the weight of their judgment, even if he refused to show it. That year, the corn borers were bad. His yields were down 10%. It wasn't a disaster, but it was a lean winter. He had to sell a young steer he'd been planning to keep just to have enough cash for seed in the spring. The dozer sat silent through the coldest months, a constant looming reminder of the time and money he had sunk into it. Money that could have bought new sprayer nozzles or a better grade of fertilizer. Doubt, cold and sharp as the winter wind, began to creep into the corners of his mind. The mid-70s arrived like a tidal wave of money. In Washington, the Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, was telling farmers to get big or get out, and to plant fence row to fence row. A massive grain deal with the Soviet Union sent crop prices into the stratosphere. Corn hit $3 a bushel, then $3.50. Soybeans went even higher. For the first time in a generation, it felt like a farmer could get truly rich. And no one was riding that wave higher than Rich Sterling. He was the golden boy of Gibson County. With the banks throwing money at agriculture, he leveraged every asset he had and then some. He bought another 2 farms, bringing his total acreage to nearly 800. His equipment lineup looked like a dealer's showroom floor. He traded in the 4320 he'd bought at the Miller auction for a massive John Deere 6030, a true monster of a tractor. He bought a brand new International Harvester 1466 with a turbo that screamed across the flat landscape. He even bought one of the first big 4-wheel drive Steigers, a green beast that could pull a 30-foot field cultivator and work around the clock. He built a new machine shed, a massive steel structure that dwarfed Silas's old wooden barn. He put up 2 new grain bins with automatic augers. His farm was a model of modern efficiency, and the Farmers and Merchants Bank in town used him as their poster child. The bank president, a man named Henderson, would point to Sterling's operation as the future. "That young man has vision," he'd say. "He understands that you have to spend money to make money." Silas, meanwhile, was having good years too. The high prices meant his modest harvests from his 160 acres were bringing in more money than he'd ever seen. But his response was different. He didn't buy more land. He didn't buy a new tractor. He took the profits and paid off the last of his farm's mortgage. On a Tuesday afternoon in 1975, he walked into Henderson's bank and handed over the final check. There was no ceremony. Henderson, busy drawing up a new multi-$100,000 operating loan for Sterling, barely looked up. To him, Silas was small-time, a relic. A man who owned 160 acres free and clear was an oddity. A man who lacked ambition. With the farm secured, Silas finally turned his full attention back to the Dozer. With the extra cash, he could afford to do the job right. He ordered new seals for the hydraulic cylinders that lifted the blade. He bought new belts and hoses for the engine. And he spent his evenings and weekends that summer putting the machine to work. He started on the 20 acres of bottomland that had been useless for generations. The first time he pushed the throttle forward and lowered the blade, the old Alice Chalmers dug into the earth with a deep, satisfying groan. It wasn't fast, but it was unstoppable. He cleared the scrub brush and small trees, piling them up to be burned. The roots of the bigger cottonwoods fought back, but he'd dig around them, cutting them one by one until the 10-ton machine could push the stump free from the earth's grip. It was slow, brutal work. He'd come home long after dark, covered in dirt and sweat, his body aching from the constant vibration and the jarring impacts. Martha would have a hot meal waiting, her expression a mixture of worry and pride. By the fall of '76, he had cleared the entire 20 acres. The next spring, he hired a tiling machine to lay drainage lines, a job made possible only because the land was now clear. He used the Dozer to backfill the trenches. That fall, for the first time in a century, that piece of land was planted to corn. It turned out to be some of his best soil, rich black dirt that had been accumulating nutrients for ages. The yield was incredible. It was a small victory, invisible to everyone but him. While Sterling was making headlines in the county paper for his massive expansion, Silas had quietly added 12% to his own farm's productive capacity without taking on a single dollar of debt. But to the outside world, he was falling further and further behind. At the local diner, the talk was all about Sterling's new combine, his vacation to Florida, his seemingly endless success. Silas, sitting in a corner booth with his coffee, would hear the whispers. "He's still got that old 2-cylinder popper. Heard he's using a $50 bulldozer to dig a pond." They saw a man afraid of progress, a man being left in the dust. They didn't see a man who was debt-free. They didn't see the rich, newly productive soil on his bottomland. They saw the old barn and the faded paint on his John Deere 730, and they judged him a failure. One evening in late 1978, Silas sat at his kitchen table, tallying up his books. The farm was in the black. He had a decent savings account built up. The Dozer was parked by the barn, its blade clean, its engine ready. He felt a quiet sense of security. He turned on the small radio on the counter. A newsman's serious voice cut through the static, talking about the oil crisis and runaway inflation. He mentioned the Federal Reserve chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, and his talk of drastic measures to cool down the economy. He talked about interest rates, which had just climbed over 10%. A cold knot formed in Silas's stomach. He thought of Rich Sterling, who he'd seen at the co-op just last week, bragging about the new line of credit he'd opened to buy the 80 acres next to him. "The bank's only charging me 12%, Sterling had laughed. "But land prices are going up 20% a year. It's free money." Silas looked out the window at the silhouette of his barn against the twilight sky. He saw the familiar shape of his 730, and next to it the hulking solid form of the old Alice Chalmers Dozer. They were his. They were paid for. They were an anchor in a world that was starting to feel like a rising tide. He didn't know what was coming, not exactly, but he knew the sound of a storm on the horizon. And for the first time, he had a feeling that his 10-ton piece of junk iron might be the only thing that could keep his family from being washed away. The first sign of trouble came not as a thunderclap, but as a quiet announcement on the radio in January of 1980. President Carter, responding to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, had embargoed grain sales to the USSR. The market, which had been the foundation of Gibson County's prosperity, vanished overnight. The price of corn didn't just fall, it plummeted off a cliff. The $3 a bushel dream evaporated, replaced by the grim reality of $1.75 and dropping. At the diner, the confident chatter of the 70s died down to worried whispers. Men who had been planning new pickups and winter vacations were now staring at their coffee cups, doing frantic silent calculations. For Rich Sterling, the embargo was a body blow. He was leveraged to the hilt, with massive operating loans based on the assumption of high grain prices. He had bins full of the previous year's harvest, holding out for a better price that would now never come. Silas felt the squeeze too. His income was cut in half, but his costs were fixed and low. His John Deere 730 ran on a sip of diesel compared to Sterling's new turbocharged behemoths. He had no loan payments. He had cash in the bank. He sold just enough grain to cover his property taxes and living expenses, and let the rest sit in his modest bin, waiting. He could afford to wait. The real crisis, however, came from the banks. The Federal Reserve, under Paul Volcker, jacked up interest rates to fight inflation. The prime rate, the number that dictated everything, began a relentless climb. 10% became 15, 15 became 18. By 1981, it was scraping 21%. For farmers with variable rate loans, it was a death sentence. A manageable payment became an impossible burden. The wolf Silas's father had warned him about was no longer just circling. It was at the door, snarling. Sterling's confidence began to fray. The easy smile was replaced by a permanent tightness around his mouth. He was working frantically, trying to outrun the interest clock. One hot afternoon in early spring, Silas was mending a fence along the road when Sterling's massive Steiger roared past, pulling a 40-foot field cultivator, churning up a massive cloud of dust. The noise was immense, a testament to raw power. Then, halfway down the field, the sound changed. The smooth roar of the big Cummins engine faltered, replaced by a series of sharp metallic pops, and then a sickening grinding noise. A plume of thick black smoke belched from the exhaust stack, and the giant tractor rolled to a dead stop. Silas watched as Sterling climbed down from the cab. He kicked one of the huge tires, a gesture of pure, impotent fury. Silas knew what that kind of breakdown meant. It wasn't something you could fix with a wrench and some baling wire. That was a complex modern engine. It meant calling the dealer, who was 50 miles away. It meant waiting for a service truck. It meant specialized diagnostic tools and parts that had to be ordered. It meant a bill that would run into the thousands. All the while, the interest on the tractor's 6-figure loan kept accumulating, every second of every day. The machine was now a liability, a dead weight of steel and debt, sitting silent in the middle of a field that desperately needed to be planted. Silas walked back to his barn. The image of Sterling standing defeated beside his broken machine burned into his mind. He checked the oil in his 730, the simple, reliable heart of his own operation. It was fine. He knew that if it ever broke down, he could likely have it running again by lunchtime with parts he already had on a shelf. The cracks in Sterling's empire began to show for all to see. He had to sell a quarter section of land, good, flat ground he had bought only 3 years prior, just to satisfy the bank for the previous year's operating note. He sold it at a loss. The land bubble had burst, and values were falling just as fast as they had risen. The sale was a sign of weakness, and in the cutthroat world of farming, weakness attracted predators. The bank, which had once treated him like a king, now viewed him with cold, appraising eyes. Mr. Henderson's friendly pats on the back were replaced by certified letters with stark, unforgiving numbers. The easy credit that had built Sterling's kingdom was now the very thing that was tearing it down. He was trapped. He had gotten big, just like they told him to, but now he was too big to fail without taking everyone, including the bank, down with him. And the bank would not allow that. By the summer of 1982, the farm crisis had descended upon Gibson County like a plague. Foreclosure auction notices began to appear in the county paper, small black and white ads that read like obituaries for family legacies. Friends and neighbors Silas had known his whole life were losing land that had been in their families for a century. The mood was grim, a thick soup of fear and quiet desperation. The sound of the auctioneer's chant, once a song of opportunity, now sounded like a funeral dirge. Silas survived. While his neighbors were drowning in debt, he was floating. His lack of payments meant he could operate on a shoestring. But even he needed cash flow. The price of corn was so low it barely paid for the fuel to harvest it. It was the old yellow Dozer that became his salvation. People couldn't afford to hire big contractors anymore, but they still had problems that needed solving. A washed-out creek crossing, a fence row that needed clearing, a new trench silo dug into a hillside. Silas's $50 gamble became an unlikely source of income. He charged a modest hourly rate, far less than the professional outfits. The Alice Chalmers HD6, loud, slow, and ugly, rumbled across the county. He became known for his skill and his fairness. He'd show up at dawn and work until dusk, the steady thunder of the Buddha diesel a reassuring sound in a landscape that had grown too quiet. He wasn't getting rich, but he was earning enough hard cash to pay his bills, buy his groceries, and keep his farm intact. He was working with his hands, using a machine he owned outright, trading his labor for his survival. It was the oldest, most fundamental form of farming, and in the wreckage of the modern agricultural economy, it was the only thing that still worked. The final notice came for Rich Sterling in the fall of '83. The Farmers and Merchants Bank foreclosed on his entire operation. All 800 acres, the massive machine shed, the new grain bins, and the entire line of shiny, new-looking equipment. The auction was set for a cold, windy day in November. Silas went, not out of morbid curiosity, but out of a sense of duty. He parked his old Chevy truck far down the road and walked up the long gravel drive. The scene was the polar opposite of the Miller auction a decade earlier. There was no excitement, no feeling of opportunity. The crowd was small and somber. Farmers stood in small groups, hands in their pockets, their faces grim. They were there to watch a man's life be dismantled, piece by piece, and they all knew it could just as easily be them. Sterling was there, standing near the house with his wife. He looked like a ghost. The swagger was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out emptiness in his eyes. He had aged 10 years in two. He wasn't the king anymore, he was just another casualty. The auctioneer, the same fast-talking earl, seemed subdued, his voice lacking its usual fire. The bidding was slow, almost painful. The magnificent machines, symbols of Sterling's ambition, sold for fractions of their worth. The giant Steiger four-wheel drive, the one that had broken down in the field, sold for less than what Sterling probably still owed on it. The International 1466, the John Deere 6030, they all went for pennies on the dollar to out-of-state buyers and equipment jockeys who smelled blood in the water. No local farmer had the money or the credit to buy them. Silas watched, a profound sadness settling over him. He saw now that Sterling wasn't a villain. He was just a man who had believed the experts, who had followed the advice of the bankers and the government men who had all promised that the good times would never end. He had simply run faster and further down a road that, it turned out, led right off a cliff. The auction moved on to the land itself. It was sold in parcels. The expansion farms went first. Then finally, they came to the last piece. Lot number 7. The original Sterling homestead, 160 acres with the house and the old barn where Rich had grown up, where his father had farmed before him. It was the heart of it all. "All right, folks, lot number 7, Earl announced, his voice heavy. The original Sterling home place, 160 acres, more or less. What am I bid?" Silence. The wind whistled around the corner of the machine shed. No one wanted to be the one to take another man's home. It felt wrong, like grave robbing. From the back of the crowd, a clear, steady voice spoke up. $50,000. Every head turned. It was Silas Blackwood. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. A murmur went through the crowd. 50,000 was a lowball offer, but it was a start. More importantly, it was a real bid, with real money behind it. Silas had come with his savings, the cash he'd carefully accumulated from his Dozer work and his frugal living. The banker, Henderson, standing near the auctioneer, looked annoyed. He was hoping for more. "I have 50,000. Do I hear 60? 60,000, gentlemen. This is prime Gibson County land." No one moved. No one spoke. They all looked at Silas, then at Sterling, who was now watching with a flicker of disbelief. The farmers of Gibson County, in a moment of silent, collective agreement, were not going to bid against Silas Blackwood. They were going to let him have it. 50,000 going once, Earl called out, looking at Henderson, who gave a slight defeated nod. 50,000 going twice. Sold. For $50,000 to Silas Blackwood. The finality of the word hung in the cold air. Silas hadn't just survived, he had prevailed. But there was no triumph on his face. He simply walked to the clerk's table, produced a cashier's check from his worn leather wallet, and signed the papers. As he walked back to his truck, he passed Rich Sterling. The two men stopped, facing each other for the first time that day. The wind whipped around them. "Silas," Sterling said, his voice barely a whisper. "Why?" "It's good land, Rich," Silas said simply. "My dad always said, you buy land when you can. You don't buy it on credit." Sterling just nodded, his eyes glistening. "What? What are you going to do with it?" Silas looked out over the fields, the stubble of the last corn crop Sterling would ever harvest there. "I was thinking," Silas said, his voice even, "it probably needs a tenant, someone who knows the ground. I'll be charging fair rent, cash, due after the harvest, not before. You interested?" Sterling stared at him, his mouth slightly open. He couldn't speak. He was being offered a chance, a lifeline, from the one man he had ridiculed for years. It wasn't pity, it was respect. It was a neighborly act of grace that transcended their rivalry. Finally, Sterling just nodded, a single jerky motion. A silent understanding passed between them. Silas got in his truck and drove away, leaving Rich Sterling standing in the driveway of the farm that was no longer his, but that he would not have to leave. The vindication Silas felt wasn't loud or boastful. It was a deep, quiet current of rightness, as solid and unmovable as the bedrock beneath his own fields. He had been right. His father had been right. Slow and steady, debt-free and self-sufficient. That was the way. It wasn't the fast track to riches, but it was the sure path to survival. In the years that followed, the story of that auction became a local legend. The community's perspective, which had once lionized Rich Sterling and dismissed Silas Blackwood, had been turned completely upside down. The men who had laughed at Silas's $50 Dozer now spoke his name with a kind of reverence. He became the man they went to for advice, not about market speculation, but about how to fix a leaking hydraulic line, how to weld a cracked frame, how to get through a tough winter. He never preached, he just shared what he knew. Rich Sterling became Silas's tenant on the old home place. The first few years were hard, but freed from the crushing weight of debt, he slowly began to rebuild. He farmed with older, smaller equipment he bought for cash. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. He and Silas were never close friends, but a deep, unspoken respect grew between them. They were two survivors of the same storm, each having learned its lessons in his own way. Silas's life continued much as it always had. He never expanded beyond the two farms. He and Martha lived comfortably, but simply in the same small house. He painted the barn finally. He bought a newer tractor, a 10-year-old John Deere 4020, widely considered one of the best tractors ever made. He paid cash for it. His son Tom grew up and decided to stay on the farm. Silas didn't hand him the keys and a line of credit. He taught him everything from the ground up. He taught him how to read the soil, how to listen to an engine, how to tell the difference between a want and a need. One crisp autumn afternoon, years later, Silas stood by the old Alice Chalmers Dozer. It was parked in a place of honor by the machine shed, its yellow paint faded to a soft butter color, its massive blade scarred and dented from thousands of hours of hard work. It was a monument to a philosophy. Tom, now a young man with his father's solid build, was working on the John Deere 730, tuning the carburetor. The familiar rhythmic pop-pop of the two-cylinder engine echoed in the quiet air. "Dad," Tom called over, "number 2-cylinder is running a little rich. Think I should lean it out a bit?" "Do what you think is best," Silas said, a smile touching his lips. "You know that machine as well as I do now." He laid a hand on the cold steel of the dozer's blade. It felt like shaking hands with an old, trusted friend. He thought of the laughter at the Miller auction, of Sterling's taunts about progress, of the long nights spent covered in grease, coaxing the old machine back to life. He thought of the quiet desperation of the 80s and the steady, thundering rumble of this machine that had helped his family push through it. He looked across his fields, free and clear, all the way to the horizon. He could see the roof of the old Sterling place, where Rich was likely getting his own harvest in. The sun was low, casting a golden light over the land. It was a light that felt earned. He heard his father's voice, as clear as if he were standing right beside him. "Debt is a wolf, son." "It sure is, Dad," Silas whispered to the wind, "but we kept it from the door." The steady, comforting rhythm of the old John Deere was the only answer, a heartbeat of resilience passed down from one generation to the next, a sound that promised the farm and the family would endure.